The grand assembly hall stretched out like a crystal cave that someone had filled with stars. Lee Hyun sat in the human section, a small blue chair that looked tiny next to the massive seats built for creatures 3 times his size. Around him, beings from 847 different worlds whispered, clicked, hummed, and made sounds he had no names for. Lee adjusted his dark blue diplomatic uniform and checked his translator for the 100th time today. The small device clipped to his collar would turn his Korean and English words into whatever language each alien species needed to hear. It was good technology, but it could not translate the feeling behind words. That was something Lee would have to do himself. Next to him, Park Mina shuffled through her digital notes. She was his aide, a smart woman who had studied alien cultures for 15 years before joining the diplomatic corps. Her job was to keep track of which species might be offended by which gestures, which ones considered eye contact rude, and which ones thought humans smelled like dying flowers. "The Vorthans are up next," Park Mina whispered to Lee. "Remember, they consider loud voices a sign of mental illness." Lee nodded. He had been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 3 years now. 3 years of careful words, polite smiles, and pretending that humanity belonged among species that had never known war the way humans understood it. 3 years of being the reasonable voice for a species that most aliens thought was barely civilized. The massive hall fell quiet as Counselor Thisara rose from her seat. The Vorthan looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a tree, her translucent body glowing with soft blue and green lights. The colored lights that ran through her body like veins pulsed faster when she was excited or angry. Right now, they were pulsing very fast. "Honored council members," Thisara began, her voice carrying easily through the hall's perfect acoustics. "Today we must address a growing concern about one of our newest member species." Lee felt his stomach tighten. He had suspected this was coming. For months there had been whispered conversations that stopped when humans entered the room. Trade. Agreements that took longer to approve when Earth was involved. Scientific expeditions that somehow never had room for human researchers. "The humans," Thisara continued, "present us with a unique problem. Not because they are openly hostile, but because they bring the shadow of violence into every interaction." Several alien species made sounds of agreement. The crystalline Zentari chimed like wind bells. The insect-like Kresh clicked their mandibles in rhythm. Even the peaceful plant creatures called the Verdani rustled their leaves in what Lee had learned was their version of applause. "In the past 50 rotations," Thisara said, using the galactic standard for measuring time, "we have observed disturbing patterns in human behavior. They speak of defense protocols when we discuss simple trade routes. They mention strategic positioning when we plan cultural exchanges. They build ships with weapons when we build ships for exploration." The lights in Thisara's body pulsed, brighter as she warmed to her topic. "But most troubling of all, they see threats where none exist. They prepare for wars that will never come. They maintain armies to fight enemies they have never met." Lee kept his face neutral, but inside he was starting to get angry. Park Mina placed a gentle hand on his arm, a reminder to stay calm. Around the hall, more species were joining in the chorus of agreement. "The humans suffer from what our xenopsychologists have identified as species-wide trauma response," Thisara announced. "Their entire civilization bears the psychological scars of their violent past. They cannot conceive of true peace because they have never experienced it." A holographic display appeared above the center of the hall, showing images that made Lee's jaw clench. Battle scenes from Earth's history, but not the full context. Just the violence, the destruction, the aftermath of wars. No explanation of why those wars were fought, what they were defending, or what they learned from them. "Look at their entertainment," Thisara continued as the display shifted to show clips from human movies and games. "Violence is art. Conflict is recreation. They celebrate warriors and write songs about battles because they cannot imagine a world without them." The Kresh ambassador, a being that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a diplomat, stood to speak. "The data supports Counselor Thisara's assessment," it said in its buzzing voice. "Human colonies maintain military forces 3 times larger than any other species. They build defensive systems around farming worlds. They teach their children combat techniques as standard education. Not just combat, added the representative from the gas giant dwellers called the Ethereals, whose voice sounded like wind through mountains. They teach their young to think strategically, to plan for multiple outcomes, to prepare for worst-case scenarios. This is not the mindset of a peaceful species. Lee watched as species after species nodded, clicked, hummed, or otherwise agreed with what they were hearing. These beings who had evolved from filter feeders and hive minds and symbiotic plant colonies could not understand why humans always seemed ready for a fight. The Vorthon counselor brought up more evidence. Human diplomatic language was full of military terms. Human businesses operated like armies with chains of command and strategic planning. Human sports were mostly competitive contests that simulated conflict. Even human relationships were described using war metaphors. People talked about battles with their families and fighting for their marriages. "We do not question their good intentions," Thaisara said, her bioluminescent displays dimming, slightly to show she was trying to be fair. "But intention is not enough. The humans bring chaos wherever they go because they expect chaos wherever they go. They see enemies in friends, threats in opportunities, and war in peace itself." The hall erupted in discussion. Dozens of different species talking at once, creating a symphony of alien languages that the translators could not keep up with. Lee caught fragments. Dangerous mindset, psychological contamination, influence on younger species. Park Mina leaned over to whisper in his ear. "Sir, I'm getting reports from our intelligence assets. 43 species have moved their research vessels to what they're calling safe distances from human space. They're not just worried about us influencing other species. They're worried about us, period." Lee felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. These aliens thought they were protecting themselves from humanity's violent nature. They had no idea what they were actually dealing with. The Vorthon counselor called for order, her lights pulsing in the pattern that meant she was reaching her conclusion. "Therefore," she announced, "the Council must take steps to contain this psychological contagion. The humans must be quarantined from sensitive negotiations. Their military forces must be monitored. Their expansion must be limited until they can overcome their species-wide trauma response." "In simple terms," she said, looking directly at Lee Hyun, "humanity is too broken by its own violence to be trusted with peace." The hall fell silent. 846 different species waited to see how the human ambassador would respond to being called a war-fearing primitive who could not be trusted with civilization itself. Lee Hyun sat perfectly still for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Park Mina watched him carefully, knowing the signs when her ambassador was about to stop being diplomatic. Finally, Lee stood up. Lee Hyun rose from his chair with the slow, controlled movement of a man who was choosing his actions very carefully. The massive hall, which moments before had been filled with the sounds of 800 alien species discussing humanity's psychological problems, fell completely silent. He stood there for 30 seconds without saying a word. 30 seconds where the only sound was the soft hum of the hall's environmental systems and the nervous shifting of beings who suddenly realized they might have made a mistake. Park Mina watched her ambassador with growing concern. She had worked with Lee for 2 years and had seen him angry before, but this was different. This was the kind of quiet that came before storms. She reached for her communication device, ready to warn Earth Command that the situation was about to change dramatically. "War-fearing," Lee said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's perfect acoustic systems. The translator, at his collar, turned his words into hundreds of alien languages, but somehow the tone remained exactly the same in all of them. Cold, controlled, dangerous. He repeated the word, letting it hang in the air like a blade. "War-fearing." The Vorthon counselor's bioluminescent displays flickered nervously. Several species in the front rows actually moved their chairs back slightly, an unconscious response to something in the human's posture that their evolutionary instincts recognized even if their civilized minds did not. "Counselor Thaisara," Lee said, turning his attention to the jellyfish-like alien who had just spent 20 minutes explaining why humanity was too traumatized by violence to function properly in civilized society. "You've presented a very interesting theory about human psychology." Park Mina activated her holographic display system, ready to show the carefully prepared presentation they had brought. Peaceful first contact scenarios, humanitarian aid missions, scientific achievements, cultural exchanges. All the good things humanity had done since joining the galactic community. Lee waved her away without looking at her. "No," he said firmly. "No defensive presentations, no careful diplomacy, no polite corrections of your misunderstandings." The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. Park Mina had never heard her ambassador speak like this. Around the hall, alien beings who had been confidently discussing humanity's psychological problems suddenly looked uncertain. "You want to understand why humans seem to fear war?" Lee asked, his dark eyes scanning the assembled representatives of nearly 1,000 worlds. "You want to know why we maintain fleets? Why we train soldiers? Why we speak of strategy and defense even when we're talking about trade agreements?" He paused, letting the question settle in the alien minds around him. "Let me tell you about fear, counselors." Lee began to walk slowly across the space in front of the massive curved seating area where the council members sat. His footsteps echoed in the crystal hall, a steady rhythm that somehow seemed more threatening than any weapon. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "We do fear war. Every human fears it. We fear it in ways that your species, with your peaceful evolutionary histories, cannot possibly understand." The crystalline Zentari chimed nervously. The insect-like Kresh stopped their rhythmic clicking. Even the plant creatures called the Verdani held their leaves completely still. "But you've made one critical error in your analysis," Lee continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You assume we fear war because we're weak, because we're traumatized, because we're broken by our violent past and can't move beyond it." He stopped walking and turned to face the council directly. "We don't fear war because we're weak," Lee said, and something in his voice made several alien species unconsciously activate their personal defense shields. "We fear war because we're too good at it." The hall erupted in confused sounds, chirps, clicks, hums, and harmonics that the translators couldn't keep up with. The meaning was clear in any language: disbelief, confusion, and the beginning of real concern. Park Mina's fingers flew over her controls as alerts started pouring in from outside the hall. The research vessels that 43 different species had positioned at safe distances from human space were suddenly very interested in moving to even safer distances. "Sir," she whispered urgently to Lee, "the Kresh have just activated their home fleet. The Vorthans are requesting emergency session protocols. I think they're starting to understand that this isn't going the way they planned." Lee nodded slightly but didn't stop his slow pace across the hall's speaking area. "You want to know what humans actually fear?" he asked the increasingly nervous assembly. "We fear the moment when diplomacy fails. We fear the moment when someone pushes us past the point where we can pretend to be civilized." A new voice cut through the hall's communication system. Captain Kim Jun of the Human Deep Space Fleet, his image appearing as a hologram near Lee's position. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and the kind of calm expression that professional soldiers wore when they were tracking 43 different potential threats at the same time. "Ambassador," Kim said, his voice professionally neutral, "we're detecting movement from what our sensors identify as 40 different species fleets. They appear to be taking defensive positions around the Nexus system. Should we consider this a hostile action?" Lee looked up at the hologram of his military counterpart, and Park Mina saw something pass between the two men. An understanding that came from years of working together to keep humanity's more dangerous capabilities under control. "Stand down, Captain," Lee replied calmly. "Maintain current positions and monitor the situation. Take no aggressive action unless directly threatened." "Understood, Ambassador," Kim said, but before his image faded, he added, "For what it's worth, sir, our threat assessment protocols indicate that approximately 60% of the species represented in that hall have military capabilities roughly equivalent to what Earth possessed during our early space age. The remainder are essentially civilian populations with no meaningful defensive capabilities." The hologram disappeared, leaving behind a silence that felt very different from the one that had greeted Lee's initial rise from his chair. "You see," Lee said, turning back to the council with what might have been a smile. "You're already afraid. And I haven't even begun to explain what happens when humans stop being afraid of war." The Vorthan councilors' bioluminescent displays were now pulsing so rapidly they looked like a strobe light. "Ambassador Lee," she said, her voice noticeably higher than it had been during her confident presentation, "surely you're not suggesting that humanity would resort to violence over a simple diplomatic disagreement?" Lee looked at her for a long moment, and Park Mina realized that her ambassador was about to say something that would change humanity's relationship with the galaxy forever. "Counselor Thisara," Lee said quietly, "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm explaining why we work so hard to make sure that question never needs to be answered." Around the hall, beings who had spent the last hour confidently diagnosing humanity's psychological problems were beginning to realize they might have seriously misunderstood what they were dealing with. Lee walked back to his position in front of the human section, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he stood there like a man who was just getting started. "You called us war-fearing," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive hall. "You're absolutely right. We are terrified of war, but not for the reasons you think." Lee Hyun stood in the center of the Grand Assembly Hall like a man who had just decided to stop pretending. Around him, representatives from nearly 1,000 worlds waited to hear why humanity feared war, expecting perhaps an explanation about trauma or psychological damage or the horrors they had witnessed in their violent past. They were about to learn something very different. "We don't fear war because we might lose," Lee said, his voice cutting through the crystalline hall like a blade through silk. "We fear war because we know exactly how it ends when humans stop holding back." Park Mina activated the holographic display without being asked. She had worked with Lee long enough to know when he was about to abandon the carefully scripted diplomatic presentations they had prepared. The display showed not peaceful cultural exchanges or humanitarian missions, but something else entirely. "You want to understand what we're afraid of?" Lee asked the increasingly nervous assembly. "Let me show you what war looks like when humans design it." The hologram displayed footage that most of the alien species had never seen before. Not the sanitized versions of human history that were usually shared in diplomatic contexts, but raw documentation from Earth's archives. Military operations conducted with a precision that turned violence into art and destruction into science. "This is what we call combined arms warfare," Lee explained as the display showed tanks, aircraft, and infantry moving together like parts of a single organism. Ground forces, air support, and artillery working together to destroy an enemy force while minimizing our own casualties. "We developed this concept about 100 years ago. Several alien species made sounds of confusion. The idea of coordinating different types of military units was apparently foreign to them. But that's just the basics," Lee continued, and the display shifted to show something that made even Park Mina uncomfortable. "This is what we call total war. The concept that in a real conflict, there are no innocent targets. Infrastructure, supply lines, civilian manufacturing, food production, communication networks, everything becomes part of the battlefield." The crystalline Zentari made a sound like breaking glass. The concept of deliberately targeting non-military assets was clearly beyond their understanding. "We learned to calculate optimal casualty rates," Lee said, his voice growing colder with each word. "We developed mathematics to determine the most efficient ways to destroy enemy forces. We built machines whose only purpose was to kill other humans as quickly and efficiently as possible." The holographic display showed images that made several alien species turn away. Industrial warfare, where entire populations became valid targets, and destruction was measured in percentages of infrastructure eliminated. "But here's what makes humans truly dangerous," Lee said, and now his voice carried something that made the massive hall feel smaller. "We didn't just learn to fight efficiently, we learned to think about killing efficiently. We turned warfare into a science." A new voice joined the conversation as another hologram appeared. Dr. Choi Yuna, Earth's foremost military historian, materialized next to Captain Kim's communication link. She was a small woman with gentle features, but when she spoke, Her words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades studying humanity's capacity for violence. "Counselors," Dr. Choi said, her voice professionally calm. "What ambassador? Lee is showing you represents approximately 2% of human military innovation. We have entire universities dedicated to the study of warfare. We have philosophers who write about the ethics of destruction. We have poets who find beauty in battle. The plant creatures called the Verdani rustled their leaves in what Park Mina recognized as their species' expression of deep distress. The humans developed something we call doctrine," Dr. Choi continued, apparently unaware of the effect her words were having on the alien assembly. "Not just weapons or tactics, but systematic approaches to the complete destruction of enemy capabilities, air-land battle, deep strike operations, information warfare, psychological operations designed to break enemy morale before the shooting even starts." The Vorthan counselors' bioluminescent displays were now flickering so rapidly, they looked like they might short-circuit. "Dr. Choi," she managed to say, "surely this is historical information? Modern humanity has moved beyond such calculated approaches to conflict." Dr. Choi looked at the alien with the expression of someone who had been asked whether humans still knew how to breathe. "Counselor Thaisara," she said gently, "humans don't forget how to wage war. We just choose not to. There's a significant difference." Captain Kim's image shifted slightly, drawing attention back to him. "If I may, counselors," he said in his calm military voice, "our current defensive positions around Earth and our colonies were not calculated for optimal fighting advantage. They were positioned to provide maximum protection for non-combatant species." Park Mina pulled up tactical displays showing human fleet positions throughout the galaxy. What the aliens saw made several of them activate emergency communications to their home governments. Human fleets were positioned not to defend human space but to defend major shipping lanes, civilian population centers, and peaceful species homeworlds. Earth's military had spent 3 years quietly building a defensive network that protected the entire galactic community. "Every human military officer studies something we call rules of engagement," Captain Kim continued. "These are limitations we place on ourselves to prevent civilian casualties and minimize collateral damage. We have entire legal systems dedicated to determining what constitutes acceptable behavior during warfare." The insect-like Kresh ambassador made rapid clicking sounds that the translator interpreted as extreme agitation. "Captain Kim," it buzzed, "are you suggesting that humans wage war according to legal principles?" "That's correct," Kim replied. "We have laws that govern how we fight. We have courts that prosecute soldiers who violate those laws. We have international agreements about what weapons we can use, what targets we can attack, and how we must treat prisoners." The concept was apparently so foreign to the assembled aliens that many of them simply stopped making sound altogether. Lee resumed his position at the center of the hall, but now the atmosphere had changed completely. The beings who had confidently diagnosed humanity's psychological problems an hour ago were looking at the human ambassador with something approaching fear. "You see, counselors," Lee said, his voice now carrying absolute authority, "you made a fundamental error in your analysis. You assumed that because we talk about defense and strategy and worst-case scenarios, we must be afraid of losing a fight." He paused, letting that sink in. "But we're not afraid of losing. We're afraid of winning." The hall was so quiet that Park Mina could hear the environmental system cycling air through the massive space. "We maintain large military forces not because we expect to be attacked, but because we know what happens to civilizations that can't defend themselves. We teach strategy to our children because we know that unprepared people become victims. We plan for worst-case scenarios because we've lived through them." Lee looked around the assembly, making eye contact with as many species as he could. "But most of all," he said quietly, "we fear war because we know exactly what we're capable of when we stop choosing to be peaceful." The silence stretched on until finally, the ethereal representative spoke in its voice like wind through mountains. "Ambassador Lee," it said, "what exactly are you trying to tell us?" Lee smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I'm trying to tell you that you've been sharing space for 3 years with a species that could conquer this entire galaxy, if we ever decided to stop protecting it instead. The Grand Assembly Hall had never been so quiet. 847 different species sat in complete silence, processing what they had just learned about the beings they had confidently diagnosed as traumatized warfarers just an hour earlier. Li Hyun stood in the center of the crystalline space, no longer the diplomatic ambassador who had arrived that morning to defend humanity's reputation. He had transformed into something else entirely, a representative of a species that had just revealed itself to be the most dangerous predator in the known galaxy. "You call us war-fearing," Li said, his voice carrying absolute authority through the hall's perfect acoustics. "You're absolutely right. We are terrified of war." Park Mina watched her ambassador with a mixture of pride and concern. She had worked in galactic diplomacy for 15 years, and she had never seen a single speech change the balance of power in the galaxy so completely. "But we're not afraid because we might lose," Li continued. "We're afraid because we know exactly what happens when humans stop choosing to be peaceful." The holographic display activated one final time, but now it showed something that made even Park Mina catch her breath. Current human defensive positions throughout the galaxy, but displayed in a way that revealed their true purpose. "Captain Kim," Li said without turning around, "please explain to the Council our current military deployment." Captain Kim's hologram appeared, but now his calm military bearing seemed less reassuring and more ominous to the alien observers. "Certainly, Ambassador," he said, his professional voice carrying through the silent hall. "The human fleet is currently deployed in 47 different positions throughout galactic space," Kim reported. "These positions were calculated not for optimal offensive capability, but for maximum protection of civilian populations and trade routes." The display highlighted human fleet positions, and what the aliens saw made several species begin emergency communications with their home governments. Human forces were positioned to defend not human space, but the homeworlds and colonies of dozens of other species. "Our defensive grid," Kim continued, "provides protection for approximately 80% of the galaxy's civilian population centers. Our patrol routes cover 93% of major trade lanes. Our rapid response capabilities can reach any point in civilized space within 6 hours." The insect-like Kresh ambassador made rapid clicking sounds. "Captain Kim," it managed to say, "are you telling us that human military forces have been protecting our civilian populations without our knowledge?" "That's correct," Kim replied matter-of-factly. "For the past 3 years, human fleet deployments have been calculated to provide maximum protection for non-combatant species throughout the galaxy." A new voice joined the conversation as Admiral Song Tai-ho of the human Deep Space Fleet appeared via hologram. He was an older man with gray hair and the kind of weathered features that came from decades of military service in space. "Counselors," Admiral Song said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded fleets that could level planets. "Every human naval officer takes an oath to protect civilian populations, regardless of species. Our strategic doctrine is built around the principle that military force exists to defend those who cannot defend themselves." The display shifted to show detailed tactical analyses that made several alien species activate their emergency protocols. Human military planners had analyzed the defensive capabilities of every species in the galaxy and positioned their forces accordingly. "The Zentari homeworld," Admiral Song continued, "is protected by the human Third Fleet. The Verdani colonies are covered by our 7th and 9th fleets. The Vorthan trade routes are patrolled by our 2nd Fleet." Counselor Thaisara's bioluminescent displays flickered back to life, but dimly. "Admiral Song," she said in a voice much smaller than the one she had used to condemn humanity an hour earlier, "why would you protect species that just accused you of being psychologically damaged?" Admiral Song looked at the Vorthan counselor with the expression of a professional soldier who had been asked a very naive question. "Because that's what we do, counselor," he said simply. "We protect people. That's why we exist." Li turned to address the assembly directly, his dark eyes scanning the representatives of nearly 1,000 worlds, who were now seeing humanity in a completely different light. "You accused us of being afraid of war," he said quietly. "You were right. We are absolutely terrified of it. but not because we're weak or traumatized or psychologically damaged. He paused, letting his words settle in the minds of beings who were rapidly recalculating everything they thought they knew about the species they shared space with. We fear war because we know exactly how it ends when humans stop holding back, Lee said. We fear it because we know what we're capable of when we decide to stop protecting other species and start protecting only ourselves. Dr. Choi Yuna's hologram appeared one last time, her gentle academic features now seeming almost surreal given the context of the conversation. Counselors, she said in her calm, scholarly voice, human military doctrine includes something we call escalation control. These are systematic methods for preventing conflicts from growing beyond manageable levels. We maintain this control because we understand the consequences of unrestricted warfare better than any other known species. In simple terms, Captain Kim added, humans don't just know how to fight. We know how to stop fighting before we do permanent damage to galactic civilization. The crystalline Zentari made their sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, which Park Mina recognized as their expression of profound relief. Lee walked back toward his seat, but stopped before sitting down. You wanted to know why humans seem to see threats everywhere, he said to the assembly. It's because we know what real threats look like. You wanted to know why we maintain large military forces. It's because we know what happens to civilizations that can't defend themselves against species like us. He looked around the hall one more time, his gaze taking in representatives from worlds that had existed in peace for millennia. You wanted to know why we talk about strategy and defense even when we're discussing trade agreements, Lee continued. It's because we know that the only thing standing between galactic civilization and the kind of warfare that humans are capable of waging is our choice to keep protecting you instead of conquering you. The silence that followed was different from any quiet that had filled the hall before. It was the silence of beings who had just realized they had been living under the protection of creatures they had completely misunderstood. Finally, the ethereal representative spoke in its voice like wind through mountains. Ambassador Lee. It said slowly, what you're telling us is that humanity has been protecting us from yourselves? Lee nodded. Among other things, yes. And the reason you maintain such large military forces is not because you expect to be attacked, but because you're the most dangerous species in the galaxy? That's correct. And your warfaring behavior is actually the result of your understanding. What you're capable of if you ever stop choosing peace, you're beginning to understand. The ethereal was quiet for several long moments. When it spoke again, its voice carried something that might have been awe. What you're describing is not psychological trauma, Ambassador Lee. What you're describing is wisdom. Lee smiled, and for the first time since rising from his chair, it was a genuine expression of warmth. Now you're getting it, he said. Around the hall, representatives from nearly 1,000 worlds began to understand that they had not been sharing space with damaged, war-fearing primitives. They had been under the protection of apex predators, who had chosen to become guardians instead of conquerors. The vote to quarantine humanity was quietly withdrawn. The emergency fleets that 43 species had moved to safe distances began returning to their normal positions. And throughout the galaxy, civilizations that had existed in peace for millennia began to understand that their peace had been protected by creatures who knew the true cost of war. Lee Hyun sat back down in his small blue chair, once again looking like nothing more than a diplomatic ambassador in a well-tailored uniform. But the galaxy would never see humanity the same way again. Lee Hyun walked slowly around the speaking area of the Grand Assembly Hall, his footsteps echoing in the crystalline space like a countdown timer. The representatives from nearly 1,000 worlds watched him with the kind of attention that prey animals gave to predators who had just revealed their true nature. Let me tell you a story about evolution, Lee said, his voice carrying easily through the perfect acoustics of the hall. Every species here has a beautiful tale of how they developed intelligence, how they learned to work together, how they built their civilizations. Park Mina activated the holographic display again, this time showing evolutionary trees and development paths for various alien species. The images were peaceful, showing gradual development from simple organisms to complex, cooperative civilizations. The Fortans, Lee said, nodding toward Counselor Thesara, whose bioluminescent displays were still flickering nervously, evolved from filter feeders in peaceful ocean environments. They learned intelligence as a way to better cooperate in processing nutrients from their water world. The display shifted to show the Vorthan homeworld, a beautiful aquatic paradise where jellyfish-like creatures worked together in massive, harmonious colonies. The crystalline Zentari emerged from hive-mind mineral colonies, Lee continued, his tone almost conversational now. They developed consciousness as a way to better coordinate the growth of their crystal cities. Individual thought arose from collective need. More images appeared, showing the geometric beauty of Zentari civilization, their crystal spires reaching toward alien stars in perfect mathematical harmony. The Verdani evolved from symbiotic plant networks that learned to share resources across entire continents, Lee said, gesturing toward the plant creatures who were holding their leaves perfectly still. They became intelligent as a way to better coordinate planetary ecosystems. Beautiful stories, Lee said, and for a moment his voice held genuine warmth. Evolution toward cooperation, intelligence developing to serve harmony, consciousness emerging from the desire to work together for the common good. The display shifted and suddenly the images were no longer peaceful. Earth appeared in the hologram, but not the Earth that aliens usually saw in diplomatic presentations. This was Earth as it actually existed, a blue and green world that was also a graveyard of extinct species. Humans, Lee said, his voice growing colder, evolved differently. Dr. Choi Yuna's hologram reappeared, her gentle features contrasting sharply with the images now filling the display. Counselors, she said in her calm academic voice, humans descended from persistence hunters. Our ancestors looked at animals 50 times their size and decided to follow them across continents until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. The display showed reconstruction footage of early human hunting parties. Small, relatively weak primates, pursuing massive herbivores not through strength or speed, but through sheer relentless determination. We are the descendants of creatures who specialized in never giving up, Dr. Choi continued. Our evolutionary advantage was not cooperation or harmony, but the ability to continue pursuing a goal long after any sane creature would have stopped trying. Several alien species made sounds of discomfort. The concept of persistence hunting was apparently disturbing to beings who had evolved from peaceful filter feeders and cooperative plant networks. But that's just biology, Lee said, resuming, his slow walk around the speaking area. What made humans truly dangerous was learning to apply intelligence to the problem of killing efficiently. The holographic display shifted to show human technological development, but not the version usually presented to alien audiences. This was the real progression. Stone tools designed for breaking bones, spears engineered for maximum penetration, bows calculated for optimal range and accuracy. We didn't just learn to hunt, Lee explained. We learned to think about hunting. We developed mathematics to calculate trajectory and impact force. We built tools specifically designed to cause maximum damage to living tissue. Captain Kim's image appeared again, his military bearing now seeming less professional and more ominous given the context. What the ambassador is describing, Kim said in his calm voice, represents the foundation of human military thinking. We don't just fight, we analyze fighting. We study our enemies, identify their weaknesses, and develop systematic approaches to exploiting those weaknesses. The display showed more recent examples. Human military academies where officers studied not just tactics and strategy, but psychology, economics, logistics, and systems analysis. War colleges where future generals learned to think about conflict as a science that could be perfected through study and practice. We turned warfare into an academic discipline, Dr. Choi added, her scholarly tone making the words somehow more disturbing. We have libraries filled with books about how to kill people more effectively. We have professors who teach courses on optimal methods of destruction. We have research institutes dedicated to developing better ways to break things and hurt people. The crystalline Zentari made their sound like breaking glass again, but louder this time. The concept was apparently beyond their ability to process. But here's what makes it truly terrifying, Lee said, stopping his pacing to face the assembly directly. We didn't stop with individual combat, we learned to organize killing on an industrial scale. The holographic display shifted to show images that made several alien species activate their personal defense shields instinctively. Factories producing ammunition and weapons, assembly lines turning out tanks and aircraft, entire national economies converted to the production of military equipment. This is what we call total war, Lee explained, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority. The concept that in a real conflict, every person, every resource, every piece of infrastructure becomes part of the war effort. Civilian factories producing military equipment, farmers growing food for armies, scientists developing better weapons, children collecting scrap metal for ammunition. Park Mina watched the alien representatives with growing concern. Many of them were showing signs of what human psychologists would recognize as acute stress reactions. The plant creatures were dropping leaves. The insect-like species were making rapid clicking sounds. Even the usually calm ethereals were generating wind patterns that suggested extreme agitation. We created poetry about the beauty of destruction, Lee continued relentlessly. We wrote songs celebrating battles and honoring warriors. We built monuments to commemorate successful killing. We turned violence into art. Dr. Choi's image shifted slightly as she accessed new files. Counselors, if I may share some examples of human military literature, she said in her gentle academic voice. We have entire genres of fiction dedicated to exploring different aspects of warfare. We have poems that find beauty in battle. We have philosophical works that examine the ethics of violence. We have children's games that simulate combat, Captain Kim added. We have sports that are essentially stylized warfare. We have entertainment industries built around the celebration of conflict. The Vorthon counselors' bioluminescent displays suddenly went completely dark, which Park Mina recognized as their species' equivalent of fainting. And then, Lee said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, after we had perfected the art and science of killing, after we had turned destruction into an academic discipline and violence into entertainment, we looked at what we had become, paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable, and we said, never again. The display shifted one final time, showing not weapons or battles, but something else entirely. Human peace treaties, international laws governing warfare, military academies where officers learned not just how to fight but when not to fight, rules of engagement designed to minimize civilian casualties, courts that prosecuted soldiers for war crimes. We became so good at war that we scared ourselves, Lee said quietly. So we built systems to control our own capacity for violence. We created laws to govern our own behavior. We established institutions whose job was to prevent us from doing what we were too good at. He looked around the assembly, meeting as many alien gazes as he could. You call us warfearing because we maintain military forces. You're absolutely right. We maintain them because we remember what happens to civilizations that can't defend themselves against creatures like us.